January 7th, 2002. It's around 7 o'clock in the morning. My wife Rachel and I were just waking up when we hear it was the FBI. They entered our home with a search warrant looking for anything and everything they could get their hands on related to my boss and his company. I would soon discover that I would be spending 33 months in a federal prison for a crime I didn't knowingly commit because I had blind spots. Today we're going to look at your blind spots so that you can make better decisions and hopefully stay out of prison. And I think we would all agree that staying out of prison is a really good idea. Well, as it turns out, my boss Lawrence, over 7 years, took more than $91 million from over 5,000 investors in what the FBI called the largest stock fraud in the history of the state of Washington. I worked for him for that last 15 months of that period and never once saw prison coming. Welcome to the blind spot zone. Everyone here has a blind spot, and I'm going to prove it to you right now. Please grab that bookmark that you were handed on your way in today, and grab it with your right hand, putting your thumb to the right of the X, like so. Now, extend your arm out in front of you as far as you can, close your right eye, and stare at the X with your left eye. Now, while you're staring at the X, you will see the circle in your peripheral vision. Slowly start moving the bookmark closer until that circle disappears. Somewhere in there. Now, you all are having way too much fun with this exercise. That is what's called a biological blind spot. It's a place in the back of your retina that simply can't receive light. We all have it. Now, I remember 1984. I was in the Air Force. I was stationed at McClellan Air Force Base in Sacramento, California. I'm fresh out of the house. I'm excited to be there on my own. I'm checking out my new dig. So I'm kind of walking along the military base, and I see in my peripheral vision this flag football game. So I'm watching the football game, and bam! Oh, out of nowhere, this light pole hits me in the forehead. So I drew just enough blood and a bump to go down to the base medical facility. I get down there and I'm sitting with the doctor, and of course he gives me a clean bill of health. He said, the only thing damaged here is your ego. But I'm still fuming about this concept, and I was like, but doc, I don't understand. Who in their right mind puts a light pole in the middle of a 3-foot wide sidewalk? Well, son, around here we call that military intelligence. After the report was filed, they literally moved the sidewalk around the light pole, finally. But if we're not paying attention to our blind spots, they can cause harm to ourselves and to others. Now, according to kidsincars.org, about 300 children are killed every single year in what's called a back-over collision. In other words, we're not paying attention to the blind spots behind the vehicles. Now, sadly, about 70% of those children are killed by their parents or a close relative. If we're not paying attention to our blind spots, they can cause harm to ourselves and to others. You know, we have entire industries that aren't paying attention. Think about the taxi industry never seeing Uber coming. I mean, who'd have thought that someday anybody with reliable transportation would suddenly become a competitor to a taxi cab, right? What about this industry? What about the hospitality industry with the advent of Airbnb? Sometimes we get stuck in, this is the way we've done it, this is the way we will always do it. We're not paying attention to what's coming. We're also not paying attention in our businesses. I was doing a study for a dental group that I was speaking for years ago about fraud, and I came across a story of a lady named Holly Keats. Now, she was arrested at the airport on her way to a luxurious 2-week, all-expense-paid Hawaiian vacation. Her boss paid for the trip. The problem is he didn't know it. Over 4 years, Holly took more than $30,000 from her dentist. Now, part of the study and part of what I was doing for the client was I ended up doing a survey, and so I called this dentist, and he was kind enough to share some information with me, and what he said was that Holly was his most trusted employee. She had been with the firm more than 10 years. She ran most of the back office. She didn't have direct access to the bank account, but she figured out how to beat the system. We're not paying attention enough in our business. We're also not paying attention in our families. Now, how many here have teenagers? Raise your hand, please. A moment of silence. What are they doing this weekend? Really? How about your preteens? Other than playing Pokemon Go all over town, what are they doing on the internet right now? We think sometimes when our kids are little and they're running all over the house or screaming and yelling, they've got the whole neighborhood invited, and we think for moments that, oh, it's going to be great when they're out in college. But the empty nest syndrome doesn't work like that. What happens is that they do leave the house. We realize that we haven't communicated together deeply for a long time, and now we have nothing in common, and suddenly we become a statistic. We're not paying attention. We're also not paying attention to ourselves. Now, I like to think of ourselves as this holistic mind, body, spirit, right? We're not paying attention to our minds. We're not paying attention to what goes into our minds and what's impacting our decision-making processes. According to the latest studies, about 170 minutes a day is how much television the average American adult is watching. Now we're getting better, we're watching reality TV. We're not paying attention to our health. We think we're doing really well if we're following the standard American diet and watching our calories. The problem is the standard American diet has all the recipes in it for heart disease and kidney disease and diabetes, and gosh, the list goes on, you name it. Actually, think about it for a second. What is the acronym for standard American diet? SAD. We're not paying attention to our spiritual self. Now, this is the essence of who we are. This is not a religious talk, but sometimes we find ourselves with a set of beliefs, not because we've paid attention or done the due diligence ourselves, but simply because that's the way we were raised, or that's the culture that we live in. We're simply not paying attention. Now, the first time I ever really came across this understanding or this idea that there are things called psychological blind spots, not just biological blind spots, I was in my attorney's office. From the time the FBI came into our house to the time I was assigned a public defender, and that scared me all by itself, Carol and I had been arguing for about a month. She wanted me to sign a plea bargain agreeing to serve up to 10 years in a federal prison for a crime I didn't believe I committed. So I assumed this conversation was going to be just like that. We walk in, we didn't even get a chance to sit down. She turns and she says, "Kevin, are you going to sign the plea bargain? Because it's not going to be available much longer." I said, "Carol, listen, I am not signing that plea bargain. I want a trial by a jury of my peers. I didn't know my boss was committing a crime, and I've watched enough Law and Order to know that you have to have intent to commit fraud. I am not signing that." She said, "Kevin, we have gone around..." Wait a minute. I just realized why you and I are not seeing eye to eye. You're seeing this through a moral perspective. I'm seeing this through a legal perspective. She said, "Kevin, morally, I believe you. In fact, I know I can convince the jury that you did not know your boss was committing a crime, but that's not going to help us because the minute the judge turns to the jury, it's going to sound like this. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, your job today is not to determine whether or not Mr. McCarthy knew he was committing a crime, but whether or not he did the actions that helped his boss commit the crime. Because under federal statutes, only one person in the conspiracy needs to know a crime is being committed." So you see, Kev, we can't win. You're going to prison. And that was the moment that I realized for the first time that two people can witness the same exact event and yet have completely different perspectives.